Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Greenewalt, and this is Public Administration, Government 241. Today we want to talk about intergovernmental relations, and we'll see what our time is like, see if we can get to public policy making as well. But let's take a look at intergovernmental relations. We find that intergovernmental relations has a very specific definition. Intergovernmental relations means all those activities that are occurring among government units of all types and at all levels within the United States. It's different than federalism. In federalism, what are we talking about? We're talking about the national government and the state governments. That's it. In intergovernmental relations, what are we talking about? We're talking about the relationships among all the governments, the national government, the state governments, county governments, local governments, special service districts such as school districts, talking about international organizations such as the United Nations. So there's lots of different units that are interacting there. And so that's what intergovernmental relations is all about. Federalism is a straight discussion or consideration of interactions between the national government and the state governments. So, the differentiation with federalism, well, we just said federalism just describes where state sovereignty lies. That's it. Federalism just describes where state sovereignty lies. So federalism only concerns the relationship between the national and the state governments. Intergovernmental relations concerns the relationships among all the governments. Well, of course, we have to go back and consider sovereignty again. And what is sovereignty? The definition of sovereignty, if you're following along, again, with your PowerPoints, sovereignty is the supreme or the ultimate political authority. Sovereignty is the supreme or ultimate political authority. And federalism represents one of three ways to organize it. Federalism represents one of three ways to organize it. We talked about this before. There's the unitary method of organizing sovereignty, the confederal way, and the federal way. Of course, the unitary way is all power in government lies with the national government. Confederal way is where all power lies with the subnational governments. And federal way is when we divide power between the national government and the subnational governments. And all the governments have meaningful and significant power, and none of them have the ability or the power to do away with each other. Well, if we look at the models of federalism and public administration, please follow around in your PowerPoints, you find that federalism is looked at in a slightly different way in our study of public administration than it would be in state and local or in American national. We've traditionally, in the field of public administration, we've had several models of federalism that have gained a permanent foothold in the discipline. We talk about our layer cake model, our marble cake model, and our picket fence model of federalism, for example. What is the layer cake model of federalism? Well, the layer cake model of federalism is just that, a layer cake. You have the national government, the state government, the regional governments, the local county government, maybe the regional government, local governments, national, state, local. And everyone has, each one of those layers has its own responsibilities and its own powers, and they're all separated from one another. That's the layer cake model of federalism. The marble cake model of federalism is, of course, a marble cake where the different layers are all intertwined with one another and they all swirl together. That would be a marble cake model of federalism. And the marble cake model of federalism would say many of the programs that the government runs, they're bits and pieces run by the national government, bits and pieces run by the states, bits and pieces run by the local governments, and they're all entwined. They're all intertwined. They're all working with one another, and sometimes it's hard to disentangle or separate them. Lastly, we have something that Terry Sanford, the former governor of North Carolina, he was a U.S. Senator from North Carolina after he ran for the presidential nomination against Jimmy Carter, but he didn't start soon enough. If he had started sooner, I think he would have won. He was a former president of Duke University. He came up with something called picket fence federalism. And picket fence federalism, you have to beware. When you look at your PowerPoints, there is an attempt to represent picket fence federalism there. It's wrong, and I've not been able to correct it. The pickets should all point downward, not up. In this picture that you have on your PowerPoint, all the pickets are pointing up. In fact, all the pickets should be pointing down. What you have with picket fence federalism is a fence with a slat for the national government at the top, a slat with the state government in the middle, a slat for the local government at the bottom, and then you have the pickets, one after the other. Each picket represents an area of public policy. Each picket represents an area of public policy for government. And as I said, the arrows should be pointing down, not up. They should be pointing down because what each picket in that fence represents, say one picket would be housing. And what you find is at the top level, there's all the money for housing that comes out of Washington, D.C., and all the rules and regulations regarding the program. Say it's the Section 8 Housing Assistance Program. That money and all those rules and regulations come out of Washington and they go down to the state level. And at the state level, in Virginia, for example, they went to the Virginia Housing Authority. And the Virginia Housing Authority then would send money and other rules and regulations down to the locals, down to us, for example, in Greene County, the Greene County Community Development Agency. And then it would be up to us to find the housing units that would qualify and that people could use. If they wanted to participate in this program, we'd have to certify participants or clients for this program, and we'd want to find, and we did, look for the neediest people in the county to do it. Then we have to put the units and the people together. And it was an interesting program, but this is how picket fence federalism works. There's housing, there's transportation, there's education, there's recreation and so forth, all areas of public policy. And the top slat is always Washington, D.C., and the money always comes out of Washington, and rules and regulations goes down to the state level. And again, at the state level, the rules and regulation and money goes down to the lowest level. So that is how picket fence federalism should be interpreted and how it works. These are our three models of federalism in public administration: a layer cake model, marble cake model, and picket fence federalism, given to us by Terry Sanford, who is passed, but formerly of North Carolina. Well, the politics of federalism, I get to talk about it. I talk about this, of course, in state and local government as well. The politics of federalism have always been reflected through the grant and aid program. Grant and aid program is what? The grant and aid program is money that's made available by Congress, money that Congress makes available to state governments and local governments, and it's to be spent in accordance with prescribed standards and conditions. Now, the grant and aid program began in 1808 under Thomas Jefferson, And we find that the Jefferson administration essentially kicked off this program by having Congress give $200,000 to the states to bolster their militias. The grant and aids after that point remained very few in number and small in size until the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, at least in the 1930s, the grant and aid system begins to grow rapidly because it helps state and local officials resolve a true dilemma at the time. We had the Great Depression upon us. Now, people wanted more food in the streets, for example. The local governments were out of money, state government was out of money, the federal government still had some money, but there was the way that we interpreted government powers in the Constitution at the time said that the federal government was not allowed to go into the states and go into localities and engage in direct service delivery. So because that belief was there are a few people that realized we could use the grant and aids to circumvent that, to run around that, and that was done. What happened was, starting with the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, money was given from the federal government to the states and localities through the grant and aid program so that they could then go onto the streets and engage in direct service delivery with the money given to them by the feds to feed their own people, for example. Now, something that let's look for a minute is why federal money looked so attractive to state and local officials. Federal money looks so attractive to state and local officials for a couple reasons. During the first half of the 20th century and the 19th century, federal government had a budget surplus, always had a budget surplus. It had a budget surplus except in time of war or depression. So the state and local officials would look at the federal government and say, aha, you always have more money than you need. This is where we can get money. Now, other reasons why federal money looks attractive to state and local officials is that federal money appears to be free money. When your congressman comes home from Washington with a check to build a new water impoundment, a new lake for your county, everybody looks around and it seems to be, it wasn't there yesterday and it's there next week. This just appears to be free money, manna from heaven, but in fact it's not. The people around the country paid for that water impoundment, didn't they? People from Michigan and Minnesota and Mississippi, Montana, all paid for that water impoundment. So federal money isn't free money, but it can appear to be. But that's another reason why federal money looks attractive. Another reason why federal money looks attractive is because who prints federal money? Who's responsible for managing the money supply? Well, the federal government. So there are lots of state and local officials who just have this belief that if the federal government prints money and they need more money, all they need to do is print some more, and voila. And in fact, we started to do that during the quantitative easing under the Obama administration, which is still, the repercussions of that are still wending their way through our financial system at the national and international levels. Lastly, the federal money looks so attractive to state and local officials because as the First World War approached, we changed our Constitution. We amended our Constitution to allow the national government to do what? To have a personal income tax. The personal income tax is the goose that lays the golden egg. You have to remember that government doesn't really reap money from Taxing businesses. You hear lots of politicians talk about soaking the rich and taxing business. But what does business do when it's taxed? Business might take a short-term temporary hit, but what business is always going to do is they're going to pass those costs on to you, the consumer. They're simply going to increase the costs of their goods and services, and you will be paying those higher taxes. You pay all taxes. The business does not really pay tax, even though there is a business tax. But when the federal government amended the national constitution so that it had a personal income tax, that was to prepare itself to pay for the First World War. There was some belief that Woodrow Wilson wanted this tax to be temporary, and after the war was over, that it would be eliminated. My grandfather, I remember, was counting on it, but it never happened. The personal income tax is the main revenue generator for the federal government, and that is looked upon with great envy by state and local officials. Well, we find that all grant and aid programs from the time that the Jefferson administration put grant and aid system into place in 1808, all grant and aid programs were what we called categorical grants. Categorical grants are grants for specific things. A grant for an ambulance, a grant for a water treatment plant, a grant for a hospital, a grant for a library. Categorical grants are monies for specific purposes defined by federal law, and all grants are categorical. Now, we find that prior to the Kennedy administration, we find that the grants really take off then during the New Deal to deal with the Great Depression. Great Depression is ultimately ended, of course, by what? By the Second World War. And after the Second World War, you find that the Truman administration is concerned about all the returning servicemen and the possibility that the country would lapse back into another Great Depression as it had been in before the war. But of course, we entered into the Cold War, and we entered into a struggle with the Soviet Union for global hegemony, if you will. And we rebuilt Europe, and we rebuilt Japan. So the wheels of industry were able to keep turning. So we had categorical grants, were the only grants that were out there. And we find that Truman leaves office, Eisenhower comes in, and then President Kennedy comes in. When President Kennedy comes into the office of the presidency, number one, he brings his own brain trust with him, just like FDR brought some of the best minds from Columbia University. John Kennedy brings with him some of the best minds from Harvard, a few from Yale and Brown as well. And if you have a PhD from Harvard, and I have a very good friend who had one, you do not need to ask the common people their opinion of X, Y, and Z. You have a PhD from Harvard. You are almost next to Providence. You don't need to consult the people. You just know. And so the Kennedy administration, as detailed in William Manchester's book, The Best and the Brightest, they brought a host of officials with them to Washington. And these people started to, number one, they believed that they knew what the people in the country needed, but they began to disregard a long-standing practice that had been followed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his people, and by Harry Truman and his people, and by Eisenhower and his people. What they began to do was they began to ignore the process of consultation. under FDR and the New Deal, when there was a plan to launch a new program. That program was planned in deep consultation and serious consultation between state, local, and federal governments. And there was a serious process of consultation. When the Kennedy administration comes to town, that process of consultation disappears. And all of a sudden, now as we are entering the new frontier of John Kennedy, this process of consultation is not there. He found that it is for two reasons. One, because these people, the Kennedy administration, believe that they're so smart, and many of them go over into the Johnson administration. The second reason is simply what was going on at that time in the country. The civil rights struggle was going on. And the civil rights struggle was, of course, focused and centered in the Deep South. And these people with PhDs from Harvard and Washington, D.C. were watching this. And instead of thinking about, gee, this is just in the Deep South, they thought that all state and local officials were rednecks and bumpkins and yahoos, and why should we consult them about anything? We are smart enough, we don't need to do that. Well, maybe you didn't need to go and consult with folks in Tallahassee, Florida, or Montgomery, Alabama, or Richmond, Virginia, but why not consult the folks in Lansing, Michigan? Why not consult the folks in Annapolis, Maryland, or Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or Albany, New York? But they didn't. So we have more and more programs being formulated in the Kennedy administration, and then, of course, when President Johnson comes into office with the assassination of President Kennedy, and he launches the Great Society, one of the three largest expansions of the federal government, along with the New Deal of FDR, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and then that heavy spending by the Barack Obama administration, the 1.8 trillion of stimulus money that never even got a name or a moniker. So we find that this is going on in the process of consultation is lost, and now we're in the Great Society, and there are many new programs, but none of them were put into place through consultation. And when the '68 presidential election is occurring and Richard Nixon is running for the Republican nomination, and then as the Republican nominee, his top domestic affairs advisor was John Ehrlichman, and John Ehrlichman went from town to town, state to state, and heard the same thing. There's all these new government programs coming out of Washington, and they must be well-intentioned, but we don't know who they're supposed to help. They don't help any of the problems that we have. Again, that reflects the lack of consultation. Well, the Nixon administration, when it went into office, when President Nixon wins the presidency in 1968, John Ehrlichman and his advisors hear the state officials, they hear the local officials, and so they move away from these practices that were followed by Kennedy and Johnson. They reinitiate consultation with state and local officials, and they set up two new programs eventually. First, they set up the block grant program. Block grants are pools of money that are dedicated to specific purposes, to a specific subject area. So they set up block grants, and that allows state and local officials to apply for some of the most needed of government funds. And then John Ehrlichman and President Nixon are still hearing about the restrictions that state and local officials face, even though they're block grants, and they can spend money on, say, you get a block grant in crime fighting, you can use it for many different things. But state and local officials still felt that this was restrictive. So President Nixon throws up his hands and he said, okay, we'll put into place general revenue sharing. And general revenue sharing is money that would be guaranteed to all state and locals governments. All they had to do was apply for it, and they could spend it for anything. Spend it for anything so long as they didn't violate civil rights, health and safety codes. They could spend it on anything. And in fact, that was in effect and worked all the way to the Reagan administration. In the second Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan eliminates general revenue sharing money. Why does he eliminate it? He eliminates it because the general revenue sharing was meant to go to the poorest parts of the country, to the Mississippi Delta, to Appalachia, into Watts and Gary, Indiana, some of the worst places for the human existence. And we find that many of those places are so poor they can't pay their employees very well. They're not trained very well. They don't know about the programs. They don't know how to apply for them. They don't know how to complete the work, the paperwork. They don't get it in on time. So those areas are not receiving the money that Nixon set up. What areas are getting that money? Well, Stamford, Connecticut, Prince George's County, Maryland, the areas that are very well off, very wealthy, have lots of resources, lots of employees that are well trained. They're right there. They knew about the program. They had the right paperwork. They filled it out correctly, and it was turned in on time. So rather than those monies building new health clinics in Appalachia and new sewer treatment plants in the Mississippi Delta, what it was doing was building new polo pitches in Stamford, Connecticut, new pools for water polo in Prince George's County. And there's nothing wrong with that, but was that the best use of our money? Ronald Reagan thought not, and therefore eliminated general revenue sharing money. So now in the federal government we have two types of grants. We have categorical grants that are for specific things, and we have block grants that are in areas of public policy. And that's it. We do not have general revenue sharing money any longer. But of course what happened coming into the Johnson administration, we find that from the beginning, the end of the Kennedy administration, the beginning of the Johnson administration, all the way to the middle of the Reagan administration, we find that one area of the country has a great advantage over every other area of the country in obtaining grant funding, and that was the South. Now, why was the South so proficient in picking up grant money? Well, it was because what body is responsible for managing our money collectively? Well, it's the Congress, right? How is the Congress organized? It's organized, or what's the division of labor? And the division of labor is by committees. Who's the most important person in each committee? The chairman. And how do we select chairman? Well, we select chairman by seniority. And which congressmen always have the most seniority? Well, it's always the Southerners. The South practices a very personal type of politics, and they send their senators and state and their representatives, their House members, back to Congress over and over and over again. So they all have high levels of seniority. In other parts of the country, we don't do that to nearly the same extent. So Southern U.S. senators and Southern U.S. representatives all have higher levels of seniority than does anyone else. So they get to chair all the important committees that deal with money. The House Ways and Means Committee that deals with taxation, the House Appropriations Committee that gives out money, generally headed by a Southerner. So the South had a huge advantage over the North and the West when it came to obtaining grant money. And what would happen is the governors of New England and the governors in the Midwest would always have a news conference after the National Governors Conference and complain about this situation. And finally, President Reagan did call in the congressional leaders while he was in office and say to them that they needed to cut back on this southern advantage, that the other areas of the country deserved money as well. So this is a struggle for funding that goes on under the politics of federalism. Well, I want to say one last thing, and that is we need to look at the presidential packages. So all of you in public administration will know which package, which domestic programs, which package of domestic programs goes with which presidency. You need to be able to associate them and know them all the time, know them together. The first package of domestic programs that was set forth by a presidential administration in the 20th century, the first one of the presidents of the 20th century, of course, was Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican. We find that he had the square deal. What was the square deal? The square deal was that every American family should have a home, a job, a cooker, a stove, a pot on the stove, chicken in the pot, and a way to get to work, whether it be a car or mass transit. That's the square deal, Teddy Roosevelt. He's followed by his Democratic cousin in the New Deal some terms later. And the New Deal, of course, was the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And we find that the New Deal consisted of the alphabet agencies. The New Deal consisted of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. We're going to take unemployed people. We're going to give them a check, but they're going to work for it. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, they had to go out and they had to put out forest fires. They had to build hiking trails. They had to build Boy Scout camps and Girl Scout camps, things of that nature, the Civilian Conservation Corps. We find that the New Deal also encompassed things like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, taking one of the purest parts of the country, Tennessee River Valley, putting dams up there to regulate flooding, and then it becomes a rich agricultural farming area. You have lots of water recreation, you have lots of water to sell, but most importantly, you have hydropower, and you have cheap electricity to power economic progress in that part of the world. So that's the TVA, and then you have, of course, the last alphabet in the alphabet agency. The last alphabet agency I should mention would be the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration. WPA was responsible for paving many thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles of American roads and building concert halls, post offices, city halls, and so forth. This was all done by the WPA under FDR. So that's the New Deal. The Fair Deal was under Harry Truman. The Fair Deal was mostly a concern about about the Great Depression reasserting itself as millions of servicemen and servicewomen returned from the Second World War, wondering where they're all going to work, where are they going to live. And we find that, of course, as we take on the work of rebuilding Japan, rebuilding Western Europe, and we take on the struggle with the Soviet Union for world hegemony, we find that, lo and behold, that there's work for everyone. And Congress was concerned about the resurrection of the Great Depression, so they create the Council of Economic Advisors and give them to the president. Harry Truman doesn't want them. He says no. Well, Congress forced him down his throat and said, you will take three top-flight economists. They will be in the White House. They will watch the economy, and you will give us a report once a year on the state of the economy. And that has been true ever since. So there's the Fair Deal of Harry Truman. Then we go into the New Frontier of John F. Kennedy. The New Frontier is just gaining steam when he was assassinated. The New Frontier consisted of Kennedy's commitment to NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to go to the moon in 10 years. It consisted of rebuilding America's conventional defense forces. He felt the Eisenhower administration had spent too much time simply on the atomic arsenal, the strategic arsenal. And so he created something called the Green Berets, a highly trained soldier that could train indigenous forces and speak in the language in the area that he or she would be located. You find that the Kennedy administration took an Eisenhower administration idea. Eisenhower had something resembling a Peace Corps, but it was only in northern South America and Central America. Kennedy had the idea to name this the Peace Corps and do this worldwide. And so these are all examples from the New Frontier. Of course, under Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy is assassinated, he creates the Great Society, where we're going to win the war on poverty and we're going to win the war in Vietnam at the same time. Again, this leads to one of the three greatest spending sprees, the three largest expansions of the federal government in our history, and that leads to Richard Nixon's run for the presidency in 1968, and when successful, the establishment of the New Federalism. And the New Federalism was simply the creation of block grants, the creation of the General Revenue Sharing program as ways to try to make federal spending far more effective in terms of the results of programs. So that will cover federalism, I believe. That covers federalism. So let me check. And that covers federalism. This takes us to the next topic. And we'll stop here. And we'll